Koan number 50, note found on the floor after a concert of John Cage music. When I talked about Koan 43, sandal locomotion, I mentioned that I was walking by that sandal on my way to and from rehearsal for a concert of John Cage music. And this note was found on the floor at that concert. And I actually found the web page for the concert. It's still up from back in 2012. This was a John Cage festival in Chicago for the 100-year, I guess, birthday of John. What would have been his 100th birthday. And there's the program right there. That's what we performed. We didn't do Child of Tree. That was a different group, and then we did this other stuff. So it was a good concert, and afterwards, I found this note on the floor. So it's kind of hard to read. So I have a transcription down here. Dynamics, all ranges. Transitions, slow to fast to slow. Solos play out. Accompanists don't cover solo. And tone quality suffering. So it's just, it's a funny note to find. This is obviously a note from like a rehearsal of probably some traditional Western music. So it's funny to find this during a John Cage concert, especially tone quality is suffering. It's just kind of antithetical to what John Cage's music is all about. Koan number 51, deciding how to write an ampersand. This is obviously a photograph of a page in a notebook where I wrote a bunch of ampersands in different ways to compare them and decide how I would start writing an ampersand from that point forward. And I've done this several times in my life where I consciously decide I'm going to start writing something in a different way. You know, my signature or a certain letter or a certain number, you know, like changing a 4 from a triangle on top to open on top. I don't really know why I make that conscious decision. I guess I have pretty good handwriting, and so I think I just like want to, if I feel like something is kind of becoming ugly, then maybe I'll change it. I remember a couple times in my life where someone made fun of me for writing something in a certain way, and in becoming embarrassed that like I didn't know how to write an ampersand correctly, or was writing a 9 weird or whatever. So, anyways, I think it's really interesting that handwriting is something that supposedly reveals something about your character, but it's also something that you can consciously change. And at some point, between my undergrad and graduate school years, I became really interested in typography. I wanted to actually become a type designer at one point. I didn't get very far into that dream, but I was really interested in typography, and I learned about the whole history of the ampersand, which is actually really fascinating. And the origin of the ampersand is the Latin word et, which means and. And so the ampersand started as just a ligature of the letters E and T. Ligature is in old school typesetting. Each character is an individual piece of metal, I guess, that is stamped onto the page. And so a ligature is like one block that actually has two letters combined. So like, like a double F or something like that, where the letter forms actually kind of merge into one thing. So the ampersand was a ligature of E and T, and over time that form evolved. But in certain fonts, you can still see the kind of origin of the ampersand. So like here, I was really kind of like experimenting with that, emphasizing that origin of E and T. And here, this is kind of similar to like Verdana, ampersand. So in certain fonts, you can see more than others. Like I think that's the Verdana ampersand there. It looks much more like an E and T than like this guy here. So anyways, I was just trying to decide how I wanted to write that, because I like emphasizing that historical ampersand ligature, but also needed to be able to write it relatively quickly. So yeah, ampersands are cool. And if you're wondering how I ended up writing it, I think it's something close to like these guys, where I do like a like this guy here, where I do a little circle on top. It's kind of 3 strokes: circle, swoosh, and then a diagonal. So there it is, ampersands. And oh my gosh, it's Koan number 52, 160 beats per minute. Probably the most well-known Koan of all. It's certainly been shown the most places. It kind of stands on its own outside of 108 Koans as an individual piece. I've shown it in film festivals, and it could be in a gallery or whatever. Gosh, I don't know what to even say about this one. It's very structural. I've been talking about structural film a lot, and this is probably the most structural of everything we've seen so far. I guess in case it isn't obvious, I'm set up instructions for myself, right? So I turn on the metronome, I walk over, and I start jumping up and down, trying to be in rhythm with the metronome so that I'm alternately hitting my feet on the ground and then clicking the remote shutter on the camera, so that those two sounds, feet on the floor, shutter click, are in sync with the metronome. So that thing I'm holding in my hand there is a remote shutter control, so that I can like click the camera shutter. So yeah, again, it's like failure, I'm trying to do something and failing, and that's okay, because the failure is what makes it interesting. And this is one of a group of Koans in which I'm just physically exhausting myself. That became, I guess, kind of a motif in 108 Koans, where my physical exhaustion becomes maybe a metaphor for something. And the relationship between still photography and video is just really interesting. I think that's what really makes this a strong piece. people really respond to this. They usually find it funny. They laugh. I don't know what else to say. I'm looking at these notes that I wrote 5 years ago, and I wrote about this Koan: division of time, long dash, each photo is a death. And I'm not sure exactly what I meant by that, but I mean, there's a lot of theory about photography as death and whatever, but I don't know what I was talking about specifically. Anyways, the next Koan is in a pair with this one, so we'll talk more. So this is kind of the lesser-known sibling to Koan 52. It's Koan number 53, 80 beats per minute, so half the tempo. This Koan, I think, is actually maybe a little more interesting than the last one because it's more difficult. First of all, I recorded this right after the previous Koan, so I was kind of already exhausted. But it's also harder because the tempo is slower, and people have a tendency to rush the beat. So if you listen to the metronome and you try to like clap along right on the beat, most people will come in early, and that combined with the fact that I am not just like tapping my foot, but I have to like jump up in the air and kind of anticipate the beat and judge how long it's going to take for my body to go up and come back down and hit the floor at a tempo this slow. It's pretty hard. So the way that musicians deal with that is to subdivide the beat. So, you know, if the beat is that, you in your head you're thinking that got 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 that, right? So at some point you can see me when I'm doing like really poorly here, you can see me like right there, like kind of start to like move my body in a way that you can see that I'm like trying to subdivide. I have no idea where this idea came from. I do not remember, but probably I was just kind of messing around in the practice room one day, had the metronome on, practicing for a long time, needed to take a break, and just started kind of playing around, and it evolved into this idea. Koan number 54, 2 spiral notebooks. This Koan, I think, is charming in its simplicity. We have an image of 2 spiral notebooks, or at least what was once a spiral notebook. So this thing on the left, which looks like almost some kind of like decaying animal carcass, I found that in the parking lot of the SIU bookstore, and I went inside and found the spiral notebook here on the right and juxtaposed them together, and there's Koan 54. I think it actually maybe has something in common with the Rhodes CD Koans, in that it kind of reveals my fascination with what happens to man-made objects when they're left out to be exposed to elements and being run over by cars and all of that kind of stuff. And there's kind of an implied passing of time here, right? Because even though obviously these are two different notebooks, it's kind of like before and after new and old comparison. So I'm going to talk about Koans 55 and 56 together because they're kind of like one Koan in two parts. They both have the same title, Two Paths, and each individual Koan is one of the two paths. So the first one, part 1, on crutches, I walked from the library to my apartment. So I've never talked about the backstory or the meaning behind these Koans. The crutches that I'm using were Young's crutches. My roommate Young, who I've talked about in a previous Koan commentary, the covering someone's holes. So if you want to know a little bit of the backstory, I guess you can go back and watch the commentary for that Koan. But I guess to recap a bit, Young was alcoholic, among other issues. And one day, in the middle of the Big Muddy Film Festival, which I was directing along with my other roommate, Darren, we were in the middle of a screening, and I get a phone call, and it's Young, and I answer, and he's hysterical and says that he's going to kill himself. So I ran from the library on campus to our apartment where he was. It's a, relatively short distance, but our apartment was just off campus. So I ran from the library to our apartment, and that was one of the worst moments of my life, I think, when I got there. And he was, he hadn't hurt himself, and I don't want to say everything turned out okay, because it didn't, but he wasn't physically hurt, but it was a very, very, very dark moment in my life. Really don't want to think about it right now, but yeah, some things went down at that moment in time. And anyways, so the crutches were Young's crutches. He was using them at one point because he had gangrene, because I guess that's a thing that alcoholics get sometimes. And he wasn't using the crutches anymore at the time that I did this Koan. He was done, and they were just kind of sitting in our apartment. And so I used those crutches to recreate my path from running from the library to our apartment on that day, on his crutches. So it was very difficult to travel that path on crutches. It was hot as hell that day. It was like dangerously hot. Like I probably should not have been doing this. It was probably kind of stupid of me, actually, because surely there was some kind of heat advisory out. It was probably over 100 degrees that day. So I guess I'll go ahead and move on to the second part, which was done on the same day. Part 2 on crutches. I walked from my apartment to the liquor store. So Young did not drive. He didn't have a car, and at one point he was, he wasn't drinking, at least that I knew of, until he relapsed, and he had walked to a liquor store that was several blocks from our apartment, and bought a big bottle of liquor. I don't know what it was. I don't remember, but bought a bottle of something and took it home and drank the whole thing. And what really kind of baffled me about that was that he made that decision, like at home in our apartment, makes the decision that he's going to walk to the liquor store, and then has several blocks of walking that path to change his mind, and he doesn't. Just the idea that just walking that distance, and the persistence of this decision that he makes to go buy alcohol and drink it. And I mean, I haven't experienced alcoholism, so I don't know, maybe it wasn't like a decision. Maybe it was just, I don't know how it works exactly, but it was just something I struggled with. And so, these two paths are, one, me going from one place to another in order to try to save Young, literally save him from killing himself. And the other path is him going to do something completely destructive to himself. So this is me recreating both of those paths, and kind of in his shoes, kind of, not his shoes, but his crutches. I guess that's all I have to say. When I got to the liquor store, which is on, I forget what the streets are called in Carbondale, but one of the main streets in Carbondale. So there were people watching me crutch down the sidewalk. And then when I got to the liquor store, I just set the crutches down in front of it and walked away, which was puzzling to some people that were watching me. And if you're wondering about the photographs, the actual documentation, so at some point in the middle of the path, I went and set up a camera on the tripod and then set it on a timer. I either set it on a timer or used the remote shutter, or a combination of those things, to take the photograph. But I did actually walk the whole path, both paths, in extreme heat. So that's 2 paths. Koan number 57, making a koan. The most meta and reflexive of all the koans. This is a screen recording of me creating Koan 57, which is itself the video of me creating Koan 57. Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. So what you see here is me in a text editor actually making this web page, putting this title on there right here, and then editing the code for this video, changing the file names to koan057.mp4, which those files don't exist yet because I'm recording it. So I type this text. This video doesn't even exist yet because it doesn't, or it didn't at the time. But now it does. So now this text is not true. So it's kind of paradoxical. And then I edit this include file, which is just a list of all the koans, and that is used. This code is used on the list view and the grid view pages. So I update that, and then I open up a FTP program and upload those files to my web server to make them live. And then I go back to the grid view page and refresh the browser, and there's Koan 57. But this video doesn't exist, or didn't exist, because that is the video that I was still recording. So, oh boy, yeah, brain hurt. Goodbye. Code number 58, 2 direction giving failures. So this is another example of me having some kind of weird miscommunication with a stranger. Pretty self-explanatory, I guess. These are actual conversations that I had where people asked me for directions, and I totally failed to help them. The first one was a guy who was not English was not his first language, and when I tried to elaborate on the directions, he clearly wasn't following me. So all he pretty much got out of it was left on Oakland, which definitely wasn't gonna get him where he was trying to go. So it was one of the, that always happens when you're giving somebody directions, I think. that they like nodding their head and okay, but whoever actually remembers all the directions that you give somebody, and that was just kind of exacerbated by somewhat of a language barrier here. I like the fact that he just says thank you and drives away. It's always like when you give somebody directions and then they like go off, it's always like you never know their fate. You never get to find out if like they actually made it to where they were trying to go and if you helped them at all. But in this case, it was definitely no, because there was a lot more to the directions than just going left on Oakland. The second part, I just did not know where the halfway house is. And I don't know, I guess that to me, that kind of revealed some kind of division between people who know where it is and people who don't. I felt bad that I couldn't help her, and I felt, ignorant that I think the halfway house actually was somewhere near our house, like in the neighborhood, in the near vicinity, but I didn't know. So yeah, I guess I like the idea of taking dialogues that are part of your daily interaction and turning them into a script. And finally this week, it's Koan number 59, Sometimes When You Travel. This is my attempt to describe a phenomenon that I have observed for a long time. And I wasn't sure if like anybody else experienced this or noticed it. It seems like actually a fairly common occurrence in my life. And when I actually set out to describe it, I found it kind of hard to describe in a way that made sense. So hopefully this makes sense. I don't know, this combination of text and diagram. The idea is like, when you're traveling, when you're driving down the street, or maybe you're walking or on a bike or whatever, you pass someone and, you might catch a glimpse of part of them, and that's the only way that you actually know that there's anybody there, because for the most part, your view of them is completely obstructed. And you're traveling in opposite directions so that your view remains obstructed. Like, so sometimes, you see somebody and you catch a glimpse of an arm and you're like, oh, who is that? And you're looking over at that direction, but because you're both traveling in opposite directions at a certain rate, this obstruction that's between you just stays in the way the whole time. So you never actually see them. You never actually see their face or their body, other than just one little glimpse. I'm curious if anyone has ever noticed this. No one has ever no one's ever mentioned this cone to me and said, "Oh my gosh, yeah, I've experienced the same thing." So
I don't know. Am I just crazy? Is it just a weird thing that happens to me, um, or not? I don't know. So tell me. I need friends to tell me what's normal or not. Okay? Goodbye.